So probably one of the most controversial topics when it comes to the 3.21 Crucible release is going to be these leveling nerfs, or the early level changes that have been happening. And you can see in the background here, we just got revealed what momentum is going to look like. And if you pay close attention here, you'll see that after an attack or two, you get this little green effect that shows on the character's feet, and then it disappears after roughly 1 second. You'll see it right here. So he attacks twice, 3 times, and then the green effect is gone by the time he gets to the next pack. So what I'm assuming that this is this is just a stacking movement speed buff that every time you attack an enemy, you get a small amount of stacking movement speed. Now, honestly, I'm not too super excited after seeing that. It looks like a very small amount of movement speed. I'm assuming it's like 1 or 2% stacking up to maybe 20 is what I would assume, maybe. Hopefully it's more than that, but we'll see. Now let's talk about these early game changes because there's on one side, there's people saying this is leveling as nerfed as it's ever possibly going to be. This is terrible, what's going on? There's some people saying, stop complaining, free game, no complaining, you can't do anything about it, come on, just get good. And as always, the actuality of the situation is somewhere in the middle. So let's talk about that a little bit. There's some bad here. There's some good here, and there's some just kind of weird changes that I can't necessarily say that I fully agree with. So let's talk about the new gems. Definitely one thing that has gotten a huge bonus when it comes to the early game leveling is going to be bow builds. One major thing is the Mana Forged Arrow support is now going to be offered early on. This is a support that allows a character to trigger additional bow attacks when you use a certain amount of mana with bow attacks. So think of this as something like if you wanted to proc like Toxic Rain or Caustic Arrow at the same time as using the other ability, or if you wanted to proc like an ability that is just going to be applying your curse or something along those lines. This should be a relatively powerful support early on, give you some extra damage or just give you some extra utility, should be pretty good. We are also getting this Prismatic Burst support. We don't know a ton about this, but once we get the gem information here, this is most likely just going to be some kind of like generic elemental proccing ability that helps do some extra damage is what I'm assuming. Hopefully this will be scalable, hopefully it'll be pretty cool, but we need the full gem information to really tell about this one. Now, I talked about momentum before. The problem here is that momentum is replacing Onslaught, and Onslaught was a pretty big staple for anyone who was trying to level through the axe faster. You typically wanted Onslaught in some form, whether it be on a support gem or on a flask or on something else, and the Onslaught support gem, which is something you got very early as like what, level 2 I think you could get it, is now gone for good, and it's being replaced by momentum support. Now, as you saw in the video at the start of this, the momentum support looks pretty lackluster. I'm hoping that maybe it stacks depending on how many enemies that you're hitting or something like that. I really hope that when we see the gem information, it makes me a little bit more excited about that, because as of right now, it doesn't look that great. We are also getting snipe support, as you can see here. This is something that was previously given by the helmet called Asylum. It is a pretty bad feeling skill. However, most skills feel pretty bad early in Path of Exile, so this isn't going to feel much different at early levels. And this could be something that could be pretty solid for maybe some early bosses while you're leveling up. Just something where you could charge up a big attack, do a bunch of damage to a boss, maybe like, think like what Puncture is currently serving for bow builds and things like that. It could be pretty solid. I'm wondering if this will be useful later on as well, maybe with some like alt qualities or just whatever the standard qualities and some gem levels. Hopefully it could be pretty cool. As a small note, they are changing the combat focus jewels to be generic elemental damage instead of elemental damage with attack skills. That's a nice change. Early on, you could get a halfway decent gem that has some elemental damage on it if you have a spare jewel slot. Now let's talk a little bit about this skill balance. So the idea here, and this is something I heavily disagree with, is that they are wanting to more normalize the difference between, say, like a high-end racer that is going to be pushing super fast with very specific strats and all this kind of stuff, and the little guy, the normal person who's just jumping in axe and such. But effectively what I felt that this has done is it's just kind of made things overall a little worse, all except for bow builds. Bow builds seem like they're coming out a little bit ahead here, but both melee and casters are kind of getting the boot a little bit here. They're trying to make it so that melee splash is a little bit more effective, and this will probably be cool for like the 1 or 2 builds that can make use of this. They're trying to buff Blight. Not very many people are leveling with chaos skills anymore, but maybe this will make single target on like damage over time type abilities, like bow damage over time type abilities, a little bit better, something like that. They nerfed Explosive Trap because some people were doing a little bit too much single target damage. Typically, Explosive Trap was used as just a extra single target damage ability tacked on to whatever else that you were doing. This is going to 3 smaller explosions instead of 4, so they're taking off like 25% off the top. They are nerfing the early game of my 2 favorite leveling abilities in the game. This is a very personal sad point for me because I really liked leveling with these 2 abilities anytime I played any kind of attack build, essentially. However, you might notice that these are getting pretty significant buffs at the high end. The base damage is going up by quite a bit on both Shattering Steel and Splitting Steel. And also, you're getting a little bit more scaling at gem level 20 from 100 to 110. Splitting Steel is also getting some interesting changes. Previously, it started at 100%, getting a huge nerf early on, so it's no longer just going to be a generic amazing leveling skill. But one change that I'm curious to see how this ends up working is it no longer has 50% less area of effect after splitting. Splitting Steel projectiles can now only travel 45 units before splitting. I'm curious to see how this works. I'm curious to see how this goes, especially at higher end, if this is going to affect the Steel Champ in any way. But this ability is also getting a pretty good buff at the high end, going from 75 to 113 all the way up to 101 to 151. So the base damage is going up quite a bit. Happy about that. Spark is getting nerfed. This is unsurprising as it's one of the more popular skills that a lot of people have been using. They're making a weird buff to Spectral Throw that hopefully will maybe bring Spectral Throw a little bit more into the light on single target type damage. That's what I'm hoping from this, but this is going to be one of those things where it's like, yeah, you're gonna have to test it before we can really know. They're changing lightning tendrils. Notably, they're making it so that instead of like this big giant pulse, it's going to be a guaranteed crit, and that stronger pulse is going to happen more often. Off the top of my head, guaranteed crits are kind of nice to have occasionally, so there might be some weird shenanigans that can happen maybe with like Ignite or something like this, with the new effect that like increases the duration or refreshes the duration of your ignites when you crit. Something along those lines could be pretty interesting with the new lightning tendrils. On top of that, it is getting a pretty massive top end buff, going from 55 to 1052 all the way up to 75 to 1420, a pretty massive bonus. Also a 30% effectiveness of added damage bonus as well. However, Phantasmal Lightning Tendrils is getting a pretty big nerf. They're also putting in this very interesting change to Explosive Concoction and Poisonous Concoction, that now they're going to use up 1 charge per projectile fired. As you might know, a lot of people leveled with Poisonous Concoction, and you would just do like LMP, GMP, or like GMP, just get as many projectiles as you possibly can. That method of playing this ability is getting GIGA-NERFED. It's going to be very hard to sustain those life lasts doing that now. So that was also nerfed pretty hard. Poisonous Concoction was another way that I enjoyed leveling, so we're going to have to find something else once again. And now let's talk a little bit about Onslaught support. So I get the idea here. They felt that Onslaught support was simply too ubiquitous. Too many people were using it, and it was just too powerful for what it was, too easy to link into something and make it better. However, the problem here is that I feel that overall, leveling in Path of Exile currently as it is just a slog. It's a grind. It's not fun. It's not entertaining. It's not enjoyable. Making all of these changes is only making it more difficult for everyone and not making it easier for anyone except the bow builds, basically, which I'm happy for, but do we really need to kill everything else in the early game? The early game of Path of Exile is already such a slog and such a like wall that so many people will simply never be able to scale past that they don't get to see later in the game. I feel like this is preventing so many people from coming back and playing. I can't tell you how many or how huge of a percentage it is of when people tell me particularly why they stopped playing Path of Exile. It's like, yeah, I log in every patch and I'm like, oh, this looks really cool, but then I take like 10 hours to go through the campaign. I just don't want to play 10 hours of a game just to get to the fun part, and it's just not really worth my time. I hear this over and over again. So I really wish that we could get something that would make the leveling experience at least a little bit less of a slog. But this, in my opinion, is not the way that we go about it. Now, attack and bow-based leveling. So they're giving us faster attack support early on, which is nice. That's going to be cool. This is going to make it so that mana is a little bit tougher very early if you are using these faster attacks, so do keep that in mind. They are also giving us Sniper's Mark, which is kind of cool. It'll give us a little bit of cleave on certain fights very early. We're getting this at level 4, which is pretty cool. They're also making the other marks available significantly early on. These are going down to like level 16 instead of being at 24 or later. And then they're changing some of the base weapon weapon types. Now, this is kind of unfortunate as they felt that scepters just had too much attack speed, so something like shield charge or anything else like leap slam, those kinds of things were simply too fast with a caster weapon. So they've decided that they would just make it so that casters are a little bit slower with their movement ability if they're using a scepter. Kind of unfortunate, don't really see the purpose here. It just kind of seems like the purpose is to make things slower, and that never really feels good. Now, talking about the wand and vendor recipe changes, I don't think that these, when it comes to leveling in particular, are as big of a deal as a lot of people are making them out to be. I actually think this is more of a problem towards the later portions of the game. So typically it's pretty hard to find a wand type that is going to be exactly what you want, especially if you're just picking items up off of the ground. And a lot of builds, especially elemental caster type builds, tend to like doing a specific kind of damage. And there are quite a few builds that don't like to do certain kinds of damage. Like there's a lot of fire builds that if you do any kind of other kinds of damage, or specifically any kind of fire damage, it bricks your build. It is relatively common nowadays. So although this change does make it so that there are a little bit higher peaks for some builds, meaning like you're going to be able to get a ton of added base damage to your spells and attacks just from the implicit that's on the item, and this is also going to be on attack, so keep that in mind that wand attack builds may make some kind of small comeback with these kinds of changes. It is also removing a lot of generic spell damage from a lot of wands, so your selection is going to go down a decent amount. So essentially just think here that we have higher peaks and lower valleys when it comes to creating wands. Now the Arcane Surge is an interesting change. I actually think that this is mostly fine. I'm curious to see if the cast speed is going to be as good as the more damage was. The only problem I have with this is that typically cast speed means that you're going to have more mana issues compared to damage. So while we're losing the more damage, gaining the cast speed, this kind of feels like a little bit of a wash to me. Maybe make it a little bit harder on mana, which I'm sure that they love because they love putting as much friction in casting your spells as they possibly can in this game. I think that this is probably just kind of a wash. And that is going to be it for the video. So TLDW, my final thoughts on everything. It just kind of feels like bow builds are going to do a little bit more damage, clear a little bit faster. They're not really going to move any faster, and everyone else is just a pretty decent amount slower than they were before. If the justification for this is to balance it more easily for like the races that are coming up in the next like Exile Con that's going, kind of feels like a bad thing because you're just pushing more new players and people who are trying to come back to the game who can't get through the slog of the campaign. You're just pushing those people away. Now, is it that significant of a deal for people who consistently play the game and are planning on getting through the campaign anyways? No, this might add, I don't know, 5-10% to the amount of time that it's going to take you to get through. It's not that huge of a deal, and you'll never have to deal with any of this after you get through your first character. But for everybody else, especially those people who don't like leveling, is a pretty sizable nerf, especially if you're taking like 10 hours to get through the campaign or even more than that. You add 5 or 10% to that, you're adding some additional hours. So remember, boys, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Raid class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.